Hello students, Mr. Young here with Chapter 22, Lesson 3. It's called Presidents of the Progressive Era. So we talked about the Progressive Era and what it was and how newspapers exposed corruption and raked the muck, if you will. And we also talked a lot about women and their contributions and how they're getting more education and having hull houses, settlement houses, things like that. And prohibition, we talked about that. But today we move on to the highest office of land, the presidency, and what were these guys doing during this whole progressive era. We're going to really hit three today. Teddy Roosevelt, Howard Taft, and then we finish it up with Woodrow Wilson. So let's see what they're up to. Okay, so in 1900, Teddy Roosevelt is on the ticket, but not as president. He's the vice president. He's running with fellow Republican William McKinley, and this actually worried the leader of the Republican Party, a guy by the name of Mark Hanna, because Mark Hanna thought that the former Rough Rider, Teddy Roosevelt, was a bit of a cowboy and a wild man. He basically told McKinley that he'd better not die because there would be a nut job as president. Less than a year later, McKinley was assassinated, and as Mark Hanna feared, the cowboy, the Rough Rider, Teddy Roosevelt, is now president in the year 1901. So McKinley had favored big business, but Roosevelt, by contrast, supported regulation of businesses and immediately went to work flexing the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been largely unused at this point, or used against unions. His first target was a railroad company called Northern Securities Company. In a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, the SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States, in 1904 finally decided that the Sherman Antitrust Law had been broken, and the Northern Securities Company was broken apart. The trust was broken apart. This actually emboldened the government to prosecute more trusts in companies and, use the Sherman Antitrust Law. Roosevelt was at this point called a trust buster. However, he did not actually oppose all trusts. He thought some were good and some were bad, depending on how they were good for public welfare. Now, Roosevelt also became involved in the labor movement. In 1902, there was a massive coal miner strike. The coal miners wanted 8-hour workdays and more pay, and management wasn't budging, and so there was a strike. And this is bad because winter is coming and people's homes are heated with coal, trains run on coal, there's no coal, there's not enough coal, and this really needs to be resolved. So Roosevelt steps in and uses what is called arbitration, which you have two sides that won't agree, they won't budge, you get a third person that makes a plan, arbitration, and then both sides have to accept what they say. So the union said, all right, we'll do whatever you say, Mr. President, but the management was like, no way, Jose. So Roosevelt's pretty upset at this. It seems like a good compromise, and he threatens management, the miner owners, that he will send in federal troops to remove the coal because the country needs it. And so the mine owners finally say, okay, we'll accept your arbitration. So Roosevelt decides that the miners will get their 8-hour workday, and they will get they'll get more pay, but the owners don't have to officially recognize the miners' union. So a little bit of give, a little bit of take. However, this isn't like the first example of the government and federal troops being basically used to support the unions, whereas usually they're used to break the strikers and get them to work again. This time the government more or less sided with the workers. So this is a new trend, a progressive trend, if you will. Now, in 1904, Roosevelt runs to be president again. He had, won as the vice president, but now he's actually running for president. He offered to the American people what he called the square deal. Everyone's going to get a square deal, which means fair and equal treatment for all. He won handily with 57% of the popular vote against a Democratic candidate named Parker. His square deal called for government regulation, reasonable regulations of business, and inspection of consumer goods. So basically people weren't getting cheated and buying dangerous products, like meat inspection, stuff like that. This was a far cry from the more hands-off approach of former pro-business presidents. Now, in terms of conservation, Roosevelt was a outdoorsman and therefore had a vested interest in preserving nature. He was called Well, this is, of course, called conservation. Roosevelt is often called the first environmental president. For example, in 1905, he proposed the creation of the U.S. Forest Service. He also had Congress set aside millions of acres for wildlife refuges, which would more or less become your national park system. Let's see. He had the National Conservation Commission created, which basically assessed and surveyed the whole nation for all our natural resources. Now, all this is not to say that Roosevelt was like a total tree-hugging hippie. He believed in business and industry as well. He just thought that industry and conservation had to be well balanced. This leads us to Taft. So, in keeping with tradition, in 1908 rolls around. Roosevelt decides, I've done 2 terms, and that's what everyone else does, so I'm going to call it quits. Instead, he supported his friend and fellow Republican Howard Taft to become the next president on the Republican ticket. With Roosevelt's support, Taft easily won the support of the Republican Party and then the nation. He defeated Democrat William Jennings Bryan in that 1908 election to become the next Republican president. Now, Taft went on, and at first to win more or break more trust, win more antitrust cases in 4 years than Roosevelt had done in 7 years. So he lacked Roosevelt's dramatic flair, but he got business done. Now this is where things get salty. Taft supported the 16th Amendment, which is essentially the income tax that we have today, albeit less complex. Woo, income tax. Thanks, Taft. Now, progressives liked the income tax because they thought it was the most fair form of taxes. You put a tax on a specific product, you tend to hurt some people more than others. Like, remember when we learned about the whiskey tax and it really hurt people from Pennsylvania, and then you had the Whiskey Rebellion? Progressive income tax sort of taxes everyone in what they thought in a more fair way. They also liked how it taxed the wealthy more. A higher percentage of their income was taxed. And they thought, progressives thought, that with the government having this new way to get money, that they could finally lower those tariffs on foreign goods. Remember, your general consumer doesn't like tariffs because it tends to just raise prices on everything. So Taft got the income tax passed, but he did not lower the tariff. And progressives were super mad about this, especially Teddy Roosevelt. He was also mad about some pro-business, anti-conservation legislation that Taft had helped with. He was so disappointed that he went to go be president again in the Republican primaries. He was a challenger for Taft in the primaries. Roosevelt, being such a popular guy, easily won the support of your common guy Republicans, but Republican leadership still supported Taft, and so Taft was going to be on the presidential ticket for the Republicans. So Roosevelt basically said, fine, I'll make my own party, and he did. Him and his supporters made the Progressive Party. And when someone asked Roosevelt if he felt healthy enough to be president, he said, I'm as strong as a bull moose, and you can use me to the limit. And at this point, people started calling it the Bull Moose Party, and it's pretty much the most successful third party ever in the history of the United States, even though he's not going to win in the election of 1912, which we'll discuss now. So having the advantage of being able to look back in history, we know now that whenever you have a third party running for president, someone gets screwed over and the other side wins. In this case, the Republican Party was split, and the Democrats ran away with it. Their candidate, Woodrow Wilson, won by the largest amount of electoral votes up to that point in history. However, Wilson was a progressive Democrat. He had criticized this growth of government from the former administrations, but he offered what was called the New Freedom. So in 1913, he was able to get Congress to finally lower that tariff that people liked. Also that year, the Federal Reserve was created to regulate banks, and the Federal Trade Commission was made to police corporations for unfair trade practices. He kind of grew the government a lot for a guy that was criticizing former presidents for growing the government. Wilson was also a partisan policy to combat child labor and more antitrust laws. However, by the year 1914, the American public was losing interest in progressive reform and more interested in international affairs and the massive war that had begun in Europe in 1914. However, that is a story for 9th graders. Ultimate cliffhanger! Alright. Dun dun dun! Your quiz is on the very next page. It's pretty much pulled from this lesson. You can read the lesson 3 in the book if you'd like, but I think I covered pretty much the essentials. Go ahead and knock out this quiz like Roosevelt knocked out a bear in a bare-knuckles boxing match surrounded by rabies-infested tigers with one hand tied behind his back. I'm being dramatic, but this is kind of what people thought about Roosevelt, the ultimate tough guy. Regardless, 10-point quiz, 5 questions, multiple choice. Go ahead and knock that out. Our next lesson, lesson 4, will be the end of the chapter after that. Excluded from reform. It's about all the haters and who they hated on. Catholics, Asians, Jews, racial violence, African Americans, Native Americans. Sort of the Debbie Downer of the lessons.